I would say I'm Black British.
I'm fourth generation Welsh on my mother's side.
So I was born in Britain, but I'm black, so my family come from St Lucia, a former British colony, and interestingly for this documentary, a former British slave colony.
لم تقم أي دولة بشحن ملايين البشر من إفريقيا إلى الأمريكيتين مثل ما فعلت بريطانيا في القرن ال18. احتلال للأرض واستعباد للناس، تاريخ وموروثات شكلت ماضي المملكة وحاضرها من اقتصاد ومجتمع ونفوذ وثروة. فما علاقة الأمس باليوم؟ وأي دور لهذا الماضي الأسود في واقع المملكة؟
So many of Britain's port cities today were established due to the British Empire and the transatlantic slave trade. Liverpool, Bristol, Cardiff and of course London were important ports in which produce from both Africa and the Americas were often brought to be traded. From these port cities, these boats would then sail to the African continents to pick up enslaved Africans, who were then taken to the Americas, sold like cattle, and there the resources that they were toiling to produce, the cotton, the sugar, the tobacco, wherever it might be, would be brought back to the ports of Britain. And so the triangular trade would continue.
It's
Europe,
Africa
and the Caribbean. So British Isles, going to Africa, the West African coast, taking people from Africa. From Africa they go to the Caribbean, and then the African people are sold in the Caribbean, and when the ships in the Caribbean, they then pick up sugar or rum or tobacco and bring that sugar, rum, tobacco back to the UK, which drives the entire kind of business. It's a massive money-making program.
Over the last couple of years, last 10, 20 years, there has been more and more interest, and people have built their academic careers in researching the facts. So we know more in terms of when I was a child, what we were taught about slavery. Slavery was all to do with the cotton fields in America and slaves in America. It was nothing to do with Britain. Now we know about the role that Britain played in the slave trade, and in fact now we know that the slave trade was begun by Britain, and it was Britain who turned the capturing of slaves into an industrial endeavour and a multi-million pound.
Britain, when it is founded in 1707, isn't founded as a nation state. It is founded as an imperial state. Slavery and colonialism have been a fundamental part of the British nation since it was founded in 1707. When we think about that history of empire, we cannot think about it unconnected to Britain's history from its inception. And I think that is really crucial for us to understand British culture, British political institutions, as well as Britain's history.
ترتبط العبودية بالإمبراطورية البريطانية ارتباطاً عميقاً، ليس لإسهام تجارة الرقيق المربحة آنذاك في الاقتصاد البريطاني فحسب، بل أيضاً لما وفرته العبودية من عمالة جعلت الكثير ممكناً ومتاحاً. فقد مثل القطن مثلاً المزروع والمحصود بأيدي العبيد عاملاً أساسياً للثورة الصناعية في بريطانيا، فضلاً عن السكر والذي وبسبب شقاء العبيد تحول من كونه ترفاً إلى شيء يستخدمه الجميع يومياً. وإذا نظرنا حولنا اليوم في شوارع لندن وكذلك المدن البريطانية الأخرى سنجد أن هذا التاريخ ما زال حاضراً. فهذا مثلاً ميوزيوم أوف دوكلاندز يتخطى كونه متحفاً فحسب، إذ كان في يوم من الأيام مستودعاً يستخدم لتخزين السكر من مزارع منطقة البحر الكاريبي. ليس المتحف الشاهد الوحيد، فالأمثلة تعد فلا تحصى. تاريخ مغيب بالرغم من حضوره الواضح، أمر دفع توني وارنر إلى تأسيس بلاك هيستوري ووكس في لندن عام 2007. جولات سياحية في أرجاء المدينة مشياً على الأقدام كما في البر والنهر، تعرف زوارها وساكنيها إلى تاريخها المنسي.
For example, you can go to what we now call Canary Wharf. It used to be called the West India Docks. And that dock complex was at the time when it was built in 1802, the biggest dock complex in the world. And it was built to handle a mass amount of trade that came from the Caribbean. That's why it's called the West India Docks, because at one time they called the Caribbean the West Indies. And they actually built that whole dock complex to handle the massive amounts of sugar and tobacco and rum that came from the Caribbean to the UK, and it went through that particular area.
Cotton and sugar and spices and cloth, those were some of the commodities that the slaves were used to produce and to bring.
It was basically free labor. So just imagine if you have 1 million people working for you for free for 1 year, you can make massive profits. And the situation was that the British had millions of people working for them for free for about 300 to 400 years.
The ways that products began to be traded by countries like Britain, enabling it to become not only a hugely powerful economy, but crucially the most influential industrialising power in Western Europe. And so these economic factors were hugely important for Britain becoming a global superpower.
In England, we do think about slavery as a part of our history here. I suppose maybe overseas they think about an American issue, and that might be to do with how the media presents it. If you watch a lot of movies, they're often set in America to do with slavery, but we were, in fact, the British were heavily involved in creating slavery in the first place.
I was born a free man, lived with my family in New York.
Be good for your mother.
Until the day I was deceived.
To Solomon.
I think one of the reasons we know a lot more about maybe American slavery than we do about the British Empire is because, of course, Britain did most of its enslaving not on the British mainland. It did it in its colonies. It can create the impression that it's something that happens elsewhere, that it doesn't bear a connection to Britain. But of course, we know that it's not a coincidence that Americans speak English. America is a former British colony. It's not a coincidence that these places in the Caribbean are places that continue to have close relationships with Britain.
What we didn't know was what was going on in the background. So the organisations, the businesses, the important people, members of the royal family who were involved in funding the slave trade. It was an industrial endeavour which made a lot of people wealthy. And so it was only much later, with academics researching more, that we found out the extent of the involvement of the slave trade and the extent to which England organised the slave trade and organised the movement of people who were enslaved.
قد يعتقد البعض أن لويلز التي دامت وصاية إنجلترا عليها تاريخاً يختلف عن الأخيرة، لا سيما في ملفات كتجارة الرقيق، إلا أنه وفي أعقاب احتجاجات بلاك لايفز ماتر والتي انطلقت من الولايات المتحدة تزامناً مع مقتل جورج فلويد ووصلت بلداناً كثيرة أبرزها المملكة المتحدة، قامت لجنة بتكليف من حكومة ويلز بتدقيق شامل استطاعت من خلاله تحديد أكثر من 200 تمثال وأسماء شوارع ومبان في ويلز مرتبطة بتجارة الرقيق. غينر ليغال والتي قادت عملية التدقيق قالت إنها فوجئت بعدد الأشخاص الذين تربطهم صلات بتجارة الرقيق، وأن هذه التجارة قد أثرت فعلاً في ويلز.
I naively thought that because Wales had been almost colonised by England, that we were the good guys, you know, that it was all to do with England. But it wasn't. So there were significant people in Wales who profited by enslaving other people. And those people were then memorialised because after making millions of pounds, by exploiting other people, by enslaving other people, they came back to Wales and became benevolent, and so monuments were put up to them. But what was pleasing was that we did find some commemoration to people who opposed the slave trade. It came from the chapels and the churches, but there were some very prominent people who were very outspoken and campaigned really hard to stop the practice.
عام 1807 وقع الملك جورج الثالث قانونا لإلغاء تجارة الرقيق. إنما قانون إلغاء العبودية صدر عن البرلمان البريطاني عام 1833 ودخل حيز التنفيذ بعد ذلك بعام واحد، محرراً أكثر من 800 ألف من الأفارقة المستعبدين، حيث تم حسبان جميع العبيد في الإمبراطورية البريطانية أحراراً بموجب القانون. لكن في سبيل تحقيق ذلك دفعت أرواح وأموال. 20 مليون جنيه استرليني في ذلك الوقت، كانت تعادل آنذاك 40% من الميزانية الوطنية، دفعت لأصحاب العبيد تعويضاً لهم على أملاكهم التي خسروها. وقد تم دفع هذا المبلغ من خلال قرض ضخم استدانته الحكومة البريطانية، ولم يتم سداده إلا قبل سنوات قليلة، وتحديداً في عام 2015.
Following the end of chattel slavery in 1838, the British government was forced to negotiate with the slaveholders and their investors, and this involved them paying compensation for their loss of human property. And I think this tells us two or three really important things. The first is that clearly the end of chattel slavery wasn't a moral epiphany for Britain. They still considered these enslaved Africans to be property. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been paying reparations for a loss of property. The second thing, of course, is that while chattel slavery ended, colonialism continued. And so the enslaved peoples weren't considered to be free enough to govern themselves or receive any kind of compensation. That compensation remained in the hands of the British slave owners. Slavery needed to be justified. It needed to be rationalised. Britain considered itself to be a nation that was an important part of the European Enlightenment. Freedom, equality, justice, individual rights. But there was a contradiction, because how could Europe profess these freedoms and rights and liberties while at the same time engaging in the genocide of indigenous peoples of the Americas, the enslavement of Africans in these colonies in the West? And so to reconcile this contradiction, they developed a culture and an ideology that today we call racism. The idea that some people can participate in this Enlightenment project, Europeans, and other people do not have the capacity to participate in these Enlightenment ideals. And it was Africans, it was indigenous peoples of the Americas, and eventually other colonised peoples who were considered to not be worthy or have the ability to participate in the Enlightenment. And I think we can see many of those legacies today as well.
لو بحثنا سريعاً في تاريخ بريطانيا الحديث سنجد أن مقتل الشاب ستيفن لورنس هنا في جنوب لندن في موقف حافلة عام 1993 قد مثل نقطة تحول فيما يخص السود في بريطانيا وملف العنصرية. ستيفن الذي كان ينتظر حافلة ليستقلها إلى بيته عندما هاجمته مجموعة شبان بيض وقتل بدوافع عنصرية.
One legacy of the slave trade and slavery is the fact that you have racism even in the 21st century. So Stephen Lawrence is a young black man who got stabbed to death at a bus stop in 1993.
The murder of Stephen Lawrence was a turning point in the history of the relationship between black people living in Britain and authorities, because Stephen Lawrence's mother, Doreen Lawrence, would not let the matter rest. And what became apparent was the way in which the police force had responded to that murder.
And at the time he was stabbed, the police said that they couldn't find the people responsible and they tried to blame the victim, etc. There was a huge protest against this lack of police action, which led to a change in law.
Investigation into his murder was considered to be corrupt, mishandled through the police investigating his friends and his families rather than the racist murderers responsible for his death. An inquiry a few years later found the police to be institutionally racist.
It was the first time in a discourse about racism and discrimination in Britain that the term institutional racism was raised. And it made people think about the way organisations were set up. That work is still ongoing. There are still lots of organisations, institutions, that refuse to accept the fact that they were institutionally racist because they don't really understand what the term means. And as for the police, the fact of the way they were then, which was wrong, and institutional racism has been proven over and over and over again.
The reason that British institutions are institutionally racist isn't because the normal functioning of British policing has been racist for years, or for generations, or for decades. It is because racism has been fundamental to British institutions for centuries, since the establishment of Britain as an imperial state in 1707. Racism has been fundamental to the justification of empire and enslavement. And therefore, until we are able to understand that these institutions are functioning not in ways which fail black communities, but indeed ways in which they were intended to police black communities, then we are not going to see the kinds of changes necessary to prevent a Stephen Lawrence case from happening again.
There is discrimination right across the board in Britain, and there is certainly still a lot of racism. And I think that will take generations to eradicate, if it ever is. It's a very deep-seated, why do you hate other people just because of the way they look? I don't know, but people do hate black people. They do hate people that don't look like them or live like them, and then they act on that hatred.
One of the most profound legacies of the British Empire was the legacy of racism. The invention of the idea that there are different human races who can be treated differently, exploited differently, and have different political freedoms imposed upon them. And it's this legacy of racial hierarchy that dictates many of the kinds of policies and practices that we see throughout global politics, whether it be foreign interventions or forms of economic exploitation or environmental degradation. But it also, of course, shapes racial hierarchies here on the British mainland. And you can see that in inequalities throughout the economic and political systems. You see it in our education and criminal justice systems. And of course, you see it on the borders of Britain as well. I don't think anyone can really imagine Britain without black people. Black people have been a part of Britain for a very long time. I mean, some historians write about black people being around in Britain before Britain was Britain. And I think today we see black people being a fundamental part of British political, cultural, as well as economic life. And I think it would be a shame of us to try to imagine anything different. And I think it's important for us to appreciate that multicultural presence, not only because of the diversity that it brings, but also because it helps us to remember why it is that black people live in Britain. It's because of those historical legacies. And it helps us to reconnect in new and interesting ways the present to the past.
The legacies of the past have shaped society today and how we operate, how we live. Some of that is for the good and a lot of it is for the bad. But I think that it's only when we really examine what those legacies are, when we break them apart and look at them honestly and openly, and we understand them, that we can bring about any change. If you tell yourselves lies, then you can't change. So we need to look honestly at what has gone on and then say, okay, how can we make this better? And that work is ongoing.
I think there is a future for the black population here because we're not going to go any place. And there's been a long history of resistance to oppression, and that resistance is carrying on.
I am an optimist by nature, so I do believe that the future will be better for black-skinned people. I think that as we move on and examine ourselves, that all the phobias, that people will be more accepting of the differences in religion, in customs, in the way you look, and we'll accept each other for our difference and celebrate our difference. That's my hope. I hope that that's how the future will pan out.
Thank you. I'm done. للزمن كفالة برسم التفاؤل بالرغم من إرث الماضي الذي لا يغيره الدهر. تراه موجوداً بكل تفاصيل الحاضر، وقد يترجم أحياناً بميزان كراهية أو عنصرية. ميزان يتأرجح عبر تواريخ البلاد وعصورها. إنما بين كل ذلك الذي حدث وما سيحدث يبقى صمود الشعوب المظلومة وحقها الفطري في المقاومة راسخاً.